We start with a group of Arizona voters who could help decide the 2022 election. They're current and former Republicans who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, but not in 2020. In this year's toss-up races, Republican candidates need to win them back. Democrats like Katie Hobbs need to keep them close. Our first guest has conducted hundreds of focus groups with voters all over the country. Her latest focus group was here in Arizona, and she's sharing her takeaways for the midterm election. Sarah Longwell, publisher of thebulwark.com. Welcome to Sunday Square Off.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I'm a big fan of your podcasts. For folks who don't know about them, can you tell us a bit about yourself and the Bulwark's mission?
Yeah, well, the Bulwark was started after the Weekly Standard was shut down for being insufficiently pro-Trump, and it started back up. We sort of birthed a new organization called the Bulwark that is focused on democracy and preserving democracy. And for me, I'm the publisher, but I also have a podcast that I do. I do a lot of work in the political space, and one of the things that the Trump era did for me was it created just a real curiosity about Republican voters. I've been a Republican my whole life, but I could never have stomached Donald Trump. In fact, I've opposed him now since he came onto the political stage. But a lot of voters love him, and I wanted to understand why. And so I started doing focus groups back in 2018, 2019, and now I do them absolutely every week with voters across the political spectrum, really trying to understand what it is that is driving voters. How do they perceive these candidates? How do we think about, politics in the future? How has the Republican Party changed? How has the Democratic Party changed? And listening to people talk about this is incredibly illuminating. It's so much better than just listening to pundits sort of, substitute their own judgment about what they think voters are thinking. I just like hearing directly from voters because they'll tell you sort of all of the things that we tend to be mystified in this very complicated political moment. Why are people tolerating election deniers? What are the issues that most motivate people? If you ask a group of people, they'll tell you those things.
Yeah, I listened to the entire 90-minute focus group, but a larger question about focus groups, they're not polls. So what can we really take away from a group of a dozen people?
Yeah, that's a great question. You should not treat focus groups like polls. I really think of them as texture. If the polls are going to tell you, hey, 50% of people think this and 45% of people think that, a focus group can often tell you why they think those things. You can kind of get under the hood and understand the why people are feeling the way that they do. And so we try not to look at the groups and say, okay, well, 8 voters were voting this way and 4 were voting this way. And so now we know what the outcome of the election is going to be. It's less about that. And it's more, okay, how are people thinking about this race? What's drawing them to a candidate? What's repelling them from a different candidate? And so it's just more texture. It's more understanding what's really going on.
And the why in this focus group is especially interesting for Katie Hobbs, and we're going to get to that in a minute, the Democratic candidate for governor. Let's get an idea first about how these voters look back on their votes for Donald Trump. We're going to put some sound up. We're using first names only. David said Trump was denigrating the office. Again, he voted for Trump in 2016. A man named Jonas has some remorse. He said he'd take mean tweets over what he's seeing today. Let's listen to David first.
I was a laughingstock, and I got so tired of defending it.
Prices are going back up. The border's a mess. I mean, there's more holes in the border than anything, and the drugs and everything coming through.
And Jonas is probably the most conservative Republican in the group, at least that I heard. But how did this group feel about their votes for Biden in 2020 or whoever they voted for in 2020?
Yeah, so these swing voters sound like the kinds of swing voters I talk to all the time, especially in these contested states where they voted for Trump in 2016, usually because, he wasn't a politician. They thought he might do something differently. They really didn't like Hillary Clinton. But by 2020, they just couldn't take any more of Donald Trump. A lot of times it wasn't even about his policies. They just could not stomach the person. But now, as we're further into the Biden administration, the voters tend to kind of go two ways. You get a lot of people who say, they do not regret their vote. They're so glad Trump is gone. Some people describe him like a car alarm that was going off that finally stopped. But then there's other people who, don't feel like things are going well in the country. They, are very worried about inflation, gas prices. And, some of them are feeling not like they want Trump back precisely, but like they're unhappy with Biden. And I think, what we're looking at in 2022, when people talk about the fundamentals, part of what they're talking about is how do people feel about the party in power? And I think what you're hearing from some of these voters is some real discouragement with how things are going. And that's why, even though they sometimes don't like the Republican candidates, some of them are considering supporting the Republicans as kind of a correction on the Democrats.
Yeah, that came through pretty loud and clear. Let's go to the governor's race. I thought this was fascinating. Just 2 of the 9 folks in the focus group were undecided. I know we're not counting votes, but Kari Lake got 2 votes from participants who voted for Lake in the primary, and they all voted in the Republican primary, to be clear, and the others, 4 others went for Karen Taylor Ropes and her opponent. What struck me was how the participants, undecided, Lake supporters, Hobbs supporters, used the same words to describe Kari Lake. Wacky, nutjob, extreme, even her supporters. Here's Nick, semi-retired, works for DoorDash and Grubhub, and he's an undecided voter. Let's listen to Nick.
Just all the mudslinging rhetoric stuff. I'm not clear on what Hobbs really has in mind. And Lake just seems extreme.
Extreme, we heard that a lot. What do you make of that? Just how, almost across the board, they interpreted or viewed Kari Lake that way?
Yeah, this is the dynamic I'm seeing play out in a lot of races in these contested states among these swing voters, where they're frustrated with Democrats. They'd like to vote for a Republican, but the candidates that they've got to choose from, a candidate like Kari Lake, the terms they use are nuts and crazy and too extreme. And, and they would rather vote for, Katie Hobbs, even though they maybe think she's a little vanilla or, they're not quite sure, but they just know that the extremism of Kari Lake is too dangerous and they don't want to have anything to do with her. And I would say, you've got a situation like that in Pennsylvania with Doug Mastriano, who's also a big election denier, bust people to January 6th. A lot of times voters are reacting to people's extreme positions on abortion. And so, they'll say that they're frustrated with the economy, they're frustrated with the inflation. But then when you give them the sort of head-to-head candidates, they'll say, this is happening a lot with Blake Masters and Mark Kelly there in Arizona, where voters, they like Kelly, okay, but they're frustrated with national Democrats. But then they look at Blake Masters and they say, this guy is way too extreme. They know his position on abortion and they don't want to vote for him.
I should say, Lake did get some, pretty articulate defenders on this panel. But I didn't hear much affirmative support for Katie Hobbs. She got the lesser of 2 evils vote, I think. Let's listen to Stephen. He's a center-right Republican. Here's what he said about Hobbs and Lake.
I'd rather have Katie Hobbs do nothing to very little than screw us over. She's a brown-nosing MAGA Trumper, and I cannot stand election deniers.
And again, that was talking about Lake at the end. So there weren't many positives for Hobbs. Is that good enough for her?
Yeah, look, it's really unclear. I do think that, a lot of times with these voters, you hear the same phrase all the time, lesser of 2 evils. And so I think the question often comes down to sort of negative partisanship. It's less about who do I like and more who am I afraid of or who's scary. And I think, look, a lot of these voters, when they talk about Lake, they think she's extreme and crazy. And so, it is less a vote for Katie Hobbs and more a vote against Kari Lake. But I see that dynamic. Voters are often not particularly enamored by individual politicians. And so it is not at all uncommon for them to kind of shrug about the candidate they're going to vote for, but be doing it because they're really afraid and really don't like the alternative.
Is that a real thing, though, when it finally comes to filling out the ballot?
Oh yeah. I mean, I got to tell you, there is no phrase I hear more than lesser of two evils. That people go into the ballot box and they say, you know, I may not love this person, but I really hate this other person. And in fact, negative partisanship has really been on the rise. Like, it is defining us more and more. I mean, the number one answer I get from people about why they voted for Donald Trump is not that they liked Donald Trump; it's that they hated Hillary Clinton. And in a lot of ways, I even hear that about Joe Biden, where, you know, you'll ask a group, you know, was your vote for Joe Biden or was it against Donald Trump? And usually more than half the group says it was against Donald Trump, because that's where their strong feeling is.
All right, keep an eye on those swing voters. Sarah Longwell, great insights. Thank you so much for joining us.